Hi, this is Andrea Takaji from Fighting for Justice Foundation. Just touching base in relation to a recent federal government inquiry that we made. So we submitted some evidence to the inquiry into organ transplant tourism to our federal government. It's an issue that you may not be aware of. So unfortunately, there are organs trafficked on the black market, both in our region and across the world. And of course, those who are rich obviously have means to therefore exploit the poor. And this is what's been happening across the world, but I want to draw your attention particularly to Australia's responsibility here. So earlier this year in February, we had a man go over to Pakistan and buy a kidney from a woman on the black market. So that means that she's poor for some money, she's cut open, her organs are given to a rich person, and then she's obviously left with less health than she could have had. So this transaction took place, as I said, in Pakistan. It was the gentleman paid $116,000 for this organ on the black market, and upon his return into Australia, he found medical complications with that transplant. So these are one of the adverse effects of organ trafficking on the black market. We also know from extensive evidence from victim survivors, their families, and from human rights advocate reports and government reports that China is a massive perpetrator of organ harvesting and transplant tourism. So they receive the tourists who require transplants, and these organs are used by the government of China from illegally detained minorities. So China at the moment is transplanting 60,000 to 100,000 organs annually. Now this is an exorbitant amount of organs, and unfortunately we do have evidence to say that minority groups are targeted. They're labelled as political dissidents, so whether it's their faith belief, their political beliefs, or other beliefs, so contrary to communism, for example. These victims are captured by the government, they're illegally detained, and a urine blood sample is taken from them for the purpose of keeping them until they have a transplant tourist who requires the match organ from them. So this continues in our region, and we have evidence to say that up to 53 Australians, in fact, went over to China for kidneys alone. So this may have been received on the black market, more likely than not in China, unfortunately, that is the case. And this is an extremely important issue to address in relation to trafficking. Because, of course, again, the vulnerable are exploited, and in this case, minority groups are not only targeted, illegally detained without due process, legal representation, but they are also tortured in prison, tormented, separated from family, and of course, their inalienable right to life eventually is taken from them. So this is a grave human right violation, and because it is occurring not only in our world but in our region, Australia has a due diligence responsibility to ensure that we're not contributing to the demand for this. So there are many things we can do. First of all, we need to make sure that we're all organ donors at the point of, death. So when my body, when I'm finished using my body, I'm going to leave it behind for someone else to use the bits and pieces that are still good. Hopefully, I can donate organs after I'm gone. Secondly, so do register if you're not registered already. Secondly, it's really important for Australia to ensure that we are not engaging in transplant tourism. That means that unfortunately people do become weary of waiting on their waiting lists for organ donations, and it can take up to 7 years, and unfortunately that's one of the reasons why transplant tourism occurs. But we need to make sure that we are acting in due diligence and actually doing research on where we're going for this and to what extent. Thirdly, we need to be aware of the medical dangers. So obviously many who have had transplants on the black market have come back with medical illnesses and complications and infections and all sorts of things. China's situation is, an interesting case study, and it becomes more complex in the sense that their current health minister who oversees these transplants is an organ surgeon himself, and he was trained at Sydney University, and he was given an honorarium doctorate for his work. And unfortunately, after it came to light that he was coordinating all of these black market operations that was taken from him. But it just goes to show Australia's involvement in this transplant tourism and organ harvesting. Thirdly, we can become advocates for those who are victims. So having this conversation with someone in your world, someone you know, is important. And that might be one step towards not only liberating other victims, because we know that human rights lawyers in China, human rights advocates who've stood up for these illegally detained minorities who are basically there for their organ donation, have been imprisoned themselves. So the lawyers, the advocates who were advocating on behalf of the illegally detained minorities were in fact detained themselves and tortured, and that is a horrific state of affairs. It's happening right now in our region in China, and we need to be cognizant of that. So it's exciting that Australia is looking to amend the legislation, and we made submissions ensuring that the Commonwealth Criminal Code is amended to ensure that those who may engage in transplant tourism are also captured within the legislation, and that there is an emphasis on prevention, because law is only as good as enforcement. But there's so much more we can do outside of legislative reform and enforcement and prevention of these crimes. Abhorrent crimes is one way that we can contribute. And of course, ensuring that Australians aren't transplant tourists is a form of prevention. So advocacy in this area is important. Awareness, do some research yourself. There's amazing studies out there. There's some great articles. Go to fightingforjusticefoundation.com and read our blog for more info. See ya.